Welcome everyone, thanks for being here. My name is Roger. And this is Ramesh, for anyone who's not familiar with Ramesh. He was my teacher in Mumbai, and I spent 4 or 5 years with him before he died in 2009. And a lot of what I share is inspired by Ramesh's teachings. For a while when I spent time with Ramesh, I wanted to put it into my words as I understood it, and time again I came to see that actually the concepts that he put forward were better. And so now I feel very glad to be able to share it in the same context, using sometimes the same words. The talks really try to focus on a very practical aspect of spirituality and the subject of enlightenment. It's approaching the situation of life from the bottom up. We very often in non-dual teachings approach it from top down, where we're talking about our essence as consciousness, and that's very profound. But sometimes it's nice to look at it from a different angle. They're not at all competing concepts. They're actually complementary. And so we try to keep it very practical. So much so that the very first question that is suggested to be asked when we find ourselves seeking, and this question is suggested because we can find ourselves seeking for 10, 20, 40, 50 years or more sometimes. If that's the case, it makes sense that we might start to feel frustrated if what we're seeking for doesn't tend to be delivered. And so the question that is suggested to be asked right up front, so that we're very clear on it, clear on the question and hopefully clear on the answer in very simple English language. The question is, what am I really looking for? In practical terms. So an answer like enlightenment doesn't suffice. Or if we were going to give a one-word answer, we need to be very clear on what that really means in practical terms. And this teaching is in the tradition of Jnana Yoga, the path of wisdom. And in the path of wisdom, the teachings are delivered in the form of concepts. And the concepts are pointers. They're received by the intellect. And ultimately the understanding is not an intellectual understanding, but the process is very much a process of the intellect. It's a process whereby the intellect comes to see the errors that the intellect has made. And in seeing that, the intellect gets reconditioned such that the errors can fall away. So what are we really looking for in practical terms? So everything that is spoken about here relates back to this answer. And the suggestion is what we're looking for is happiness in this life, for Roger in this case. Now, that might not sound very satisfactory, or we might not want to admit it. It might sound selfish. But if we drop all other concepts and actually become present with our own experience and say, why am I seeking? Why am I working so hard in life? And we'll come to the answer for ourselves. Actually, I just want to be happy. Now, if I leave it at that, I've effectively done what I said is not sufficient, given a one-word answer to this question, a one-word answer that hasn't yet been elaborated in such a way that we can understand it in practical terms. So what is happiness for the human being? Now, an important point in jnana, when we're engaging in the path and listening to concepts, is not to mistake them as truth. A concept, a teaching, is always just a pointer, which means what I'm going to put forward is not to be believed as a belief. Where it becomes useful is if you understand it intellectually, understand that the concept is just a pointer that we can investigate for ourselves and decide for ourselves whether it makes sense or not. And so all of the concepts are able to be understood intellectually. They're not complicated. And most importantly, the purpose of the concept is so that we can start to look at life in a way that maybe we haven't seen before. Check it out for ourselves, so that we get our own answers, not some answers that someone has given me. That tends to be what the problem has always been, is that we're running around with a set of beliefs about who we are, about what life is, based on information that we've accepted without necessarily checking it thoroughly for ourselves. So happiness for the human being turns out to be something very different to what we have been imagining. If we look at our movement in life, we find that our understanding of happiness is, my happiness is to be found in outcomes. That is the belief of what human happiness is. And as a result of this definition of happiness, this belief in happiness, that happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 we're forced, there's almost no option, but to engage in life in such a way where we try to control life to maximize the pleasure that we receive, because we believe that pleasure, 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 pleasure is my happiness. It turns out that human happiness is never to be found in pleasure. We've received plenty of pleasures. We know that. We get the pleasures that we want from time to time, and it doesn't deliver ongoing happiness. So what I've just put forward is a whole lot of concepts. One of them, our happiness is never to be found as a result of the flow of life, as the result of pleasure or pain. That's a concept. And we get to tick that off for ourselves. We have received pleasure, and it doesn't give us continuous happiness. So what is happiness for the human being? Where does happiness come from if it doesn't come from pleasure? The concept here is that human happiness comes not in the form of gaining anything, but comes in the form of the falling away of something. The falling away of suffering, which reveals an underlying nature of who we are, and in practical terms, that's peace of mind in daily living, regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. So human happiness turns out to be continuous unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. If our happiness was dependent on pleasure, 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 it wouldn't take a lot of thinking for us to realize that my happiness is not available on a continuous unbroken basis. Because the very nature of life is the flow of life, is pleasure sometimes and pain at others. For us to be hoping to control life such that it is pleasure, 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 is a fantasy. For as long as we believe that our completeness, our happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 which is a deeply ingrained belief that life has put in place, then it's going to be very hard for us to accept the nature of the flow of life, being pleasure sometimes and pain at others. Because that would be a terrible proposition for me and my idea of my completeness. The good news is, it turns out that my happiness is not dependent on the flow of life, not dependent on pleasure or pain, but rather my attitude to the flow of life. my attitude to the pleasure or pain in the moment. This being the case means that we can allow life to be as it is. We don't have to resist life. The reason we resist life is because life is always going to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. And to the extent that we feel we need it to be pleasure, 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 there's an automatic resistance because of a sense of feeling attacked by pain being present. An automatic resistance to life because it seems like an attack on who I am. So if it turns out that my happiness is attitudinal, just like my unhappiness is attitudinal, there's hope, given that the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. There is still hope that my happiness on a continuous basis is available. This is really good news. It turns out that our unhappiness, what we can call suffering, is based on two deeply ingrained beliefs that life has put in place. And these deeply ingrained beliefs, one of which I have been speaking about, is false, or are false. The first belief is that my happiness is to be found in pleasure in the absence of pain. And the second belief is that who I am is a separate, independent entity in complete control of everything that I think, say, and do and feel. That what I am is a separate, independent entity, and therefore I have to see the other as a separate, independent entity too. We can call this the belief in personal doership, meaning a belief or an attitude that sees everything that happens through me as my doing, my creation. So we'll investigate this. These are the two beliefs from which our unhappiness stems, suffering stems. And in practical terms, when suffering arises, it arises in one of these 5 forms: guilt, blame, pride, worry or anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So remember, where I started, the purpose for all this talking is because it is completely relevant to the answer to the question, what am I really looking for in life? Human happiness. It turns out that human unhappiness is one of these 5 forms of suffering. We might not know what human happiness is, and remember, we need to check all this off for ourselves. We say, well, actually, to be honest, I'm not sure what human happiness is, but what I do know from my own experience is that I can put my hand on my heart at a particular point through the day or through the week and say, in this moment, I am not happy. So this doesn't require us to believe anything. We can investigate it for ourselves. And so when we start doing this investigation and we see what is present, when we say, in this moment I am very clear on the fact I am not happy, the conceptual framework suggests that what we will find is one of these 5 forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry or anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. And the basis of our unhappiness are these 2 belief systems: that my happiness, my completeness, in essence, my completeness is to be found in life being pleasure, 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 and that I am the doer and the other is the doer. So let's have a look at guilt, blame and pride. Blame is an attitude to what the other has done in a particular moment that has delivered pain to me. And the attitude is, you are a separate, independent entity in complete control of what you do, and what you did has delivered pain to me. And that pain based on this other belief system is an attack on who I am, because the belief says my happiness, my completeness is dependent on pleasure, 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 pleasure. And so as a result, I'm forced to hate the other for what they have done to me. I see them as the doer. I say, you could have done it differently. What you did delivered pain to me in the flow of life. Therefore, I hate you. And that blame, when we sit with it, when we feel it, when we see it for ourselves, can be classed as an uncomfortableness with oneself. At first it's an uncomfortableness with the other for what they have done, but ultimately that feeling arises as an uncomfortableness with oneself. Guilt is based on the same principle of personal doership, but is an attitude towards something that has happened through me, not through the other. Something that has happened through me that has delivered pain to the other or to myself, and as a result of seeing myself as the doer, I'm forced to hate myself for what I did that hurt the other or hurt myself, delivered pain, on the basis that I believe I could have and should have done it differently. So guilt in its most intense forms will arise as a sense of shame or lack of self-worth. Essentially, I am not good enough the way I am. And it's based on this idea that I could have done it differently because I am the doer. Pride is based on the same principle of personal doership, but instead of an attitude towards outcomes that are painful, it's an outcome towards things that I have done that are delivering positive outcomes. And therefore that sense of personal doership kicks in and says, look what I have achieved. So the saying we've all heard that pride comes before the fall is based on this notion that pride is based on the belief in personal doership. Look what I did as a separate independent doer. And at some point very soon, because the flow of life is always pleasure sometimes and pain at others, pain is going to arise in the moment, quite probably because of something that I did. And then that belief in personal doership, which was responsible for the pride, is going to suddenly feel completely worthless or guilty. Or it will blame the other for what the other does. Now, the notion here is that these beliefs are false. They are errors. Errors that life has put in place, because it turns out on investigation that we are not the doers. Meaning, we didn't put these beliefs in place. When we see ourselves as the doer, we look at our belief systems and we claim ownership over them. So the doer aspect of us, the belief of doership in us, will look at our beliefs and say, I am responsible for my beliefs. It turns out that on investigation we find that life has forced the beliefs into place. Life has created me exactly as I am in this moment. Not my doing, but a happening. So if we look at the human being, we find that what the human being is on a biological level is determined by two factors, and two factors only. If we can find a third factor, then this notion goes out the window. But I'm quite certain, after much investigation, that to my surprise I kept finding, wow, just these two factors, my genes and my up-to-date conditioning. My genes were something that I wasn't in control of. And my up-to-date conditioning is a result of how life has impacted me moment after moment after moment, and conditioned me based on how it's impacted me, largely based on the beliefs and what I'm told by my family, by the society I grow up in, by the school I go to, the political system that's in place. And that is life putting in place my up-to-date conditioning. And in each moment, life is delivering new conditioning. And that new conditioning will add to or possibly radically change up-to-date conditioning. And so Ramesh used to say, make no mistake, this is simply new conditioning. That life in this moment is delivering, not something you were in control of, not something I'm in control of, but a happening. You had no idea exactly what was going to come out of my mouth, nor did I, frankly. And whatever comes out is new conditioning, and how it affects our up-to-date conditioning also not in our control. It'll either have an effect or it won't have an effect. Someone might be sitting there going, this is really interesting. And then they might leave and tomorrow wonder, what was it all about? I just have no idea. Someone else might be thinking, this is a load of nonsense. Why did I choose to spend Friday evening listening to this? And yet, tomorrow or the day after, they might find a certain thought arising that is clearly a result of what has been shared tonight. And furthermore, awareness might start landing on a functioning of biological aspects and psychological aspects. And there might even be another thought that says, well, actually, that is blame towards the other for what they have done that has delivered pain to me. And when I look at it, that blame is based on a belief that they could have and should have acted differently. And that action, which is painful to me, is an attack on who I am. So this new conditioning that life is delivering, how it affects us, not in our control, but if it does affect us, what it's doing is changing or adding to our existing up-to-date conditioning. And so looking at the human being again on a biological level, whatever the human being is in a particular moment as a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning that you and I weren't in control of. And so just like two chemicals that have a unique composition, these two chemicals come into contact with each other, and the reaction is something that happens as a result of the composition of the two chemicals, whether they react violently or whether they react in a harmonious manner, not up to them. A reaction that happens, not something that they sit down and discuss amongst themselves and say, how am I going to react? Let me think about it. It just happens. We tend not to have this view of ourself on a biological level. We tend to have a view that, no, I am the master of my destiny. I am the doer, meaning I am in control of the thoughts I have. Now remember, these are just concepts, not something to believe, but something we can start to investigate. And if the investigation happens, it's going to happen according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. We have to ask ourselves, is my suffering really based on these two beliefs? Is my unhappiness when it arises from time to time in life, is it really based on these two beliefs? Because if it is, I want to know about it. Even more importantly, are these two beliefs false? If we find out that the beliefs on which human suffering stands are false, then the conclusion is a great conclusion, that human suffering is an error. Suffering arises from two errors, and therefore suffering is an error. And if our happiness turns out to be the end of suffering, not the gaining of anything, but the end of suffering, then this tends to be really great news. It means my happiness, which is the end of suffering, simply requires the dissolving of these false beliefs. And it turns out when we look at the spiritual process is simply a reconditioning of the body-mind organism in such a way that the beliefs that are an obstacle to a recognition of our true nature get removed. So we might start to see the importance of asking this question, what am I really looking for? And having a really simple, clear, practical answer to it. Because if we have that, it becomes harder for the belief in personal doership, who's going to do everything it can to survive, including finding fault with a process that starts to undermine its existence. It's going to do everything it can. So to the extent that we start approaching this with a bit of critical thinking and start to come up with some very clear answers, it means a process that might go round and round in circles otherwise starts to become very focused. So, some more concepts. The flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain. What does that really mean? It means that depending on our particular makeup at a particular point in time, based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, we will have certain biological preferences. That's part of the human's makeup. And the flow of life as it unfolds, which is not in my control or your control, will either be pleasurable or painful, depending on how it relates to our biological preferences. To the extent that the sun is too hot for our biological preference, we will experience pain. If the food that we have is in line with our biological preference, it will be pleasure. If we hit our toe on the wall and the result is not in line with our biological preference, that will be experienced as pain. So whatever happens in the flow of life is either pleasure or pain, and specifically we can break it down into financial pleasure or pain, physical pleasure or pain, or emotional pleasure or pain. So if someone came to me at the end of the talk and said, I really appreciated the talk, according to my biological preferences, which still remain after the errors, the beliefs fall away, according to my biological preference, I prefer to hear someone say that they really enjoyed the talk instead of someone coming up to them and said, that's a load of nonsense. And actually, frankly, I think that you're a little silly. One is pleasurable and the other less so. So we could call that emotional pleasure or pain. If I hit my toe, it's physical pain. If the food tastes good, it's physical pleasure. And if I go to book an airline ticket, which I do a lot, and I look at the ticket from one place to another, and it comes up and it's $800. I think that's reasonable. I'll book that tomorrow. Tomorrow I go online and it's $890. So $90 more than it was yesterday. That's financial pain in the moment. If I turn on the computer and it's $720, financial pleasure in the moment, compared to booking it the day before. So the flow of life, always, we can investigate as many hypothetical situations as we like and start to see the flow of life always either pleasure or pain. The water in the shower, hot water not working, I have to have a cold shower. Pain in the moment. The water is perfect. I'm feeling cold, I get into the shower and the water's nice and warm. Pleasure in the moment. Someone shouts at me at the shop for whatever reason. Pain in the moment. Someone comes up and says, "That's a great t-shirt you have on." Pleasure in the moment. To the extent we start to see life more clearly and start to understand ourself, both on a biological and psychological level more clearly, means that we'll start to understand life, which previously was maybe a little bit of a mix of threads that were so tightly wound that we had no idea where one started and the other finished. No idea what this color thread actually means or does or how it relates to the whole system. To the extent we can start pulling it apart, then the mystery of life is always going to remain. At the end of the day, this teaching is saying that everything that happens is a happening according to God's will. Not my doing, not your doing. And a complete recognition of this, a surrender of the belief in personal doership, is a surrender to God's will and the end of suffering. So realization is a recognition that what I am is not what I have believed myself to be, not necessarily what is delivered in the experience on the surface. And as we investigate the experience more and more closely, what we find is, actually what I am as an individual is the impersonal consciousness of Source, linked to a particular body-mind organism, functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. That's what everyone is. The one impersonal consciousness of Source, linked to a particular body-mind organism, functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. And the belief in personal doership obscures that recognition. It means that my connection to Source is not seen. In effect, we can say my connection to Source is broken, although it never actually is broken. We always are the one Source functioning through the body. But it's the recognition of it that delivers the peace that we're looking for. So I have a tendency to talk a lot. So if anyone has any questions, there's a microphone just here. And if you hold the button down for a second, you'll see the green light come on. And even if I can hear you, if I'm speaking with you and you're right next to me, for the sake of the recording, if we can still speak into the microphone, that would be great. And to the extent that the questions are in relation to what I've been speaking about, that's great, because it means that we have an elaboration on what I've put forward as the beginning of the conceptual framework. But if you have some other question, feel free. And if there's no questions, I'll carry on.
I have a comment.
Okay, sure. Yes, please. If you can press the button for a second, and the green light will come on. Just hold it down. Yeah, great.
Screen? Yeah. From what I'm hearing, you're saying that, you've created this construct, this hypothetical construct to explain how you see things. So it's just attitude. It's basically what I'm hearing. It's how you look at something is what makes a difference. Mm-hmm. That's it?
Yeah, that's it. It turns out that our happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, but in our attitude to the flow of life.
Yeah.
And the current attitude we have is the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And therefore, when the flow of life unfolds as it's destined to unfold, pleasure sometimes and pain at others, our attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is forced to erupt into guilt, blame and pride, worry, anxiety, and expectation and attachment to outcome. And all of those forms of suffering are felt as an uncomfortableness with oneself. And when that uncomfortableness with oneself is really intense, we know it as extreme suffering, which is the most uncomfortable experience in life. It turns out that pain in the moment, which inspires this attitude, is a very small part of the problem in life. So we have the pain in the moment, plus this load on top of it of suffering, which is attitudinal. And it seems like, when the attitudinal suffering is there, it seems like it's all because of the pain. That the problem is because of the pain in the moment. The stubbing of the toe, or what the other person has done to betray us, or what have you. We think it's about that action. But actually the uncomfortableness, it turns out, when the suffering falls away, it becomes very apparent that the pain, yes, it's pain, but pain is not at all what I used to think it was. And so we can live with pain, especially when the suffering isn't there. And so, yes, it turns out that our unhappiness is attitudinal, and our happiness is not something gained, but the peace that is there when the suffering ends. And so we can say that our happiness is attitudinal, but we have to be careful here, because we can see that our attitude that creates suffering is a belief system. And the attitude that is our happiness is not a belief system. It's the absence of a belief system. It's the absence of the old attitude. So we could say that our happiness is the attitude of the heart, the attitude of a way of being in life, a way of being that's no longer distorted and covered up by the continuous suffering that used to arise. That's okay, we can pass it back.
Thank you.
So, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that suffering stems from these two beliefs. One being that happiness is dependent on pleasurable outcomes, and the other being the sense of the doer. So, how do we deconstruct or investigate whether these beliefs are true or not without adding on more beliefs?
Great, thank you. So some of the other concepts that were put forward, I'm very impressed. People actually listen. Because you nailed it in the question. So some of the other concepts that were put forward are already building the foundation, they're the new conditioning that will help the investigation happen. Take, for example, the explanation that says what the human being is on a biological level is dependent on two factors and two factors only. Our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Two factors that I wasn't in control of. I wasn't in control of the genes that I have, and I wasn't in control of the way life conditioned me moment after moment, which results in my up-to-date conditioning at this point in time. And so whatever I say or however I act is similar to the example of the two chemicals that had a specific chemical composition. They came together and there was a reaction. And so when we look at my interaction with life, I find that I am, on a biological level, this entity based on two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning. I find myself in a circumstance, and as a result of the circumstance I find myself in, a response or reaction. I'm not differentiating between response and reaction. To me, it's all a reaction. A reaction happens based on the circumstance I find myself in. So if I ask you, what's your name? No, the gentleman over here. Stuart. See, there was Stuart found himself in a circumstance whereby a question was posed, and as a result of his genes and up-to-date conditioning in this moment, a reaction happened. And the reaction was the answering of the question with what he has been conditioned to know as his name. So good, good outcome. Question, answer. But Stuart, in this moment, might have been designed differently to think, no, I'm not going to answer the question. This is a demonstration, and I'm going to stay silent. Right? To whatever, prove a point. And that would have been his reaction to the circumstance in that moment. Also based on his genes and up-to-date conditioning, and not his doing. Just like the response to the question, according to these concepts, is showing that a response happens through the biological entity, and that response is exactly as it's destined to be. Either destined, we can look at it destined according to God's will, according to the creation of life, which from the beginning of time to the end of time is completely predetermined to unfold exactly as it unfolds. Or, if we don't like that because it seems too theoretical or conceptual, we can start investigating it based on these more practical investigations, that the human being in any moment is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and therefore whatever they think, feel or do is a result of the circumstance they find themselves in, which is not in their control, circumstance not in your control or my control, and my makeup in the particular moment, not in my control. But a reaction, for sure, will be there. The reaction is, if thirst is felt, then I might look around and reach for a glass of water. So action is always happening in life. If we come to see, wow, my action, whatever I do in each moment, is much more dependent on these two factors than a third factor, which I assumed in the past. We assumed that there is this me, this controlling entity, this me which is a completely independent entity, unaffected by anything else. And I am the chooser. I, as the independent me, is the thinker and the actor. So this notion that whatever happens in the flow of life is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning takes away the ground on which this independent me stands. Now, the doership in us, which is an identity, could well be kicking up at this point, saying, no. But once again, these are concepts that are in my experience, and so everything I speak about is based on my own first-hand experience of a process that has led to, for many years now, the end of suffering. Because suffering no longer has a ground on which to arise. Because the beliefs that were in place, the very beliefs that I'm talking about, were highlighted as beliefs. An investigation happened. It became apparent as a result of that investigation, not my doing, all the happening, all of the thinking and the contemplating and the observing and the concluding, all based on an unfolding of life. And what unfolded resulted in a dissolving of the beliefs on which the suffering used to arise.
So just so I'm clear in my understanding, is it that the investigation of the belief, or the chipping away of the belief, happens through seeing that everything that I do arises out of either my genes or my up-to-date conditioning? The seeing of that itself sort of deconstructs this belief in being the doer, and that the seeing itself is also not my doing.
That's right.
And so when you said earlier that you said something about impersonal consciousness that is acting through this form, that it is this impersonal consciousness that is orchestrating, in a way, all this, all of the unfolding. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay, I'll move on to that, but I'd like to stick to what you just summarized in relation to how the beliefs fall away. It's exactly that. The process is that we start off with an intellectual understanding. The intellectual understanding is where we say, oh, I get it. I understand the concepts. They weren't too complicated. I understood the concepts intellectually. I'm not convinced, mind you, but I understand what is being said intellectually. Then, as the intellectual concepts start to land on life as it unfolds moment after moment, our experience, and starts to see what is being described in the concepts. So once the intellectual understanding starts to see, wow, actually that's how it's happening. I'm now seeing it, and I can put a tick next to the concept. So what I sometimes use as an example of this is an incident that happened in India at the beginning of the year. And there's lots of monkeys in India, and I was walking up a mountain path that I liked to walk up. And this one morning there was a baby monkey, like really small, days, weeks old. And it was interested to come, and it jumped up onto the rock next to me, and it sort of wanted to play. And I was just amazed at the fine details of this monkey's face. It really looks like a little human, and big eyes, and it was curious, and little fingers, really tiny fingers. And I was just really blown away. And some years prior to this, I was told by someone that if you smile at a monkey, they will take it as a sign of aggression. And I thought, really? And so I thought about it. How can that be? And it occurred to, and they probably explained it, but it occurred when we smile, we show our teeth. So in monkey language, when they show each other their teeth, it's because they want to kill each other. And so I remember that. Oh wow, that's really strange. I'm smiling. Like the theory is, I smile at a monkey because I'm happy with them, and they think I'm angry or fighting them. Anyway, so this little monkey here, and I had this warm feeling in my heart, and a big smile came across my face. And this monkey screeched as soon as it saw my smile and jumped back a meter. And then a memory of this concept that I had received 2 years earlier came to mind. And I went, it's true, tick. I didn't actually say it's true because it takes more to convince me that something is true than one bit of evidence. But what it did is it made that intellectual understanding that had been delivered several years earlier go a little deeper. And to the extent that I then want to test this a bit more, so I smiled at some more monkeys in India. And it turns out that one monkey, which was a bigger monkey, didn't jump backwards but jumped forwards. And I jumped backwards because monkeys are not to be reckoned, or they are to be, don't mess with a monkey. And there was another monkey I smiled at who was out on a bridge, suspension bridge on wire. He was out there eating, and he couldn't care less that I was smiling at him because he could see the humans over there, and I'm up here on a wire, and he just kept eating. So I got to confirm the concept with more and more observation of life itself. And so now I know that some monkeys don't care that you smile at them. Other monkeys will jump back, and some monkeys will jump forward to fight. I can generally put a big tick next to the fact that showing your teeth is a sign of aggression, but what reaction it's going to get is going to be different based on the circumstance. So anyway, that was an example of how on investigation our intellectual understanding can go deeper and deeper until at some point it's not some belief that someone has just told me, but it now is something that I know for myself based on my own investigation. And so we don't need to become molecular scientists and understand genetics on a micro level. We just need to understand that genes refers to the very complex system of genetics that I don't need to understand, and effectively means I wasn't in control of the genes. And the genes are responsible for the hardware, in a sense, the body, and then life impacts me, impacts the hardware moment after moment, and that becomes the up-to-date conditioning, and that life is always impacting the body, so always delivering new conditioning. And so my up-to-date conditioning is continually changing. So you can imagine, some people would have come in tonight with up-to-date conditioning that included a strong belief in personal doership. We know that for ourselves, if we find ourselves blaming the other whenever they do anything that hurts us and feeling guilt, and then by default we can say, oh wow, my up-to-date conditioning includes the belief in personal doership. And maybe as a result of life's new conditioning, someone could just have an insight. It might not even require much investigation. Say, I simply cannot be the doer. The other simply cannot be the doer. Everything in life is happening exactly as it's destined to happen. Not in my control and not in the other's control. And if I come to see life like that, then life is an unfolding. And the other is just a mechanism through which life is unfolding, through which my destiny is unfolding, we could say. And if I see life as destiny, my destiny, the other's destiny, if the other does something that delivers pain in the moment, what I see is that it was my destiny to experience pain in this moment, their destiny to be the instrument through which that pain is delivered. I now no longer hate the other as a separate independent entity who has delivered an attack on who I am, but rather see me and them in this together as universal brothers doing exactly what we're destined to do. That doesn't mean that the pain is not there. The pain is still there. It doesn't mean that atrocious acts won't happen through the other. They will. It doesn't make them good, but it makes them less personal. Completely impersonal, actually, if we come to see life intimately, like really see it, the way we're talking about. And the other belief, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 we can investigate that. We know we've received I'll tell you another story. Great, story time. When this seeking started, I was working in the finance industry. So this is going back 18 years ago, let's say. And I had established some goals for myself, financial goals, and I met certain financial goals. And then I put another financial goal in place, which I can't remember if it was a 1 or 2 year financial goal, but it was sort of a long-term financial goal. I think it was 2-year financial goal. And I had made some investments, some share investments, and completely luck had it that one of the investments went up 20-fold, I think it was, in the space of a month. And the financial outcome that I had set as a 2-year target was achieved in the space of a month based on luck, because I had no idea that this investment was going to perform in that way. And for a short period of time, maybe an hour or two, I was excited. Wow, look, this is amazing. And then I was driving home that afternoon, and I found myself setting a new financial target for a significantly higher amount than that for another 2 years. And it just struck me, said, really? Is this how I'm going to live my life? Setting an objective, getting it, and finding within 2 hours of having met a 2-year objective that I've set another objective, and then I imagine, I'm just going to work towards this as if it's my happiness. And then when that's delivered, if it is delivered, I had no doubt that I'd probably just set another objective. And it became clear that I've received very little out of this outcome. I've received temporary pleasure. It was fun for as long as I was excited, but it didn't deliver continuous, unbroken contentment. Within a very short time, I had set another objective up. Now, there's nothing wrong with objectives. Objectives will deliver pleasure, or if they don't get achieved, it could be pain. What's being pointed out here is that objective and the outcome is not going to deliver happiness. We know that from our own experience. And so the seeing of that time and time again, we're lucky in a sense, is that we've had plenty of those pleasures delivered to us in the past, and we see that we get them and suddenly we're looking for more, something new. So we've got plenty of experience to show us where I can go, this belief that says my happiness is to be found in pleasure. So, we have the idea, I just need this job promotion. Once I get this job promotion, everything will be okay. That's a demonstration of the belief that my completeness is to be found in an outcome. An even better one is, when I meet my soulmate, everything will be okay. These are all outcomes in the flow of life, either pleasure or pain. They are never, never, never going to deliver ongoing contentment or happiness for the human being. That's a concept. I'm convinced, based on my own investigation, it is very, very accurate. Don't believe it. Hopefully it becomes part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and an investigation for yourself happens, such that you can start putting ticks next to it. And the putting of ticks next to it, which is once again not your doing, I didn't put myself in a situation where the monkey did all those things, and the realization, and that was all, it just unfolded. And the conclusions that I formed based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, if I was given up-to-date or genes where I was very mentally challenged, then that whole circumstance might have unfolded, and my brain capacity might not have been able to conclude what it concluded. So the fact that the conclusion happened, not my doing, a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So someone who's great at maths and claims ownership over, look how great I am, I can solve this equation that no one else in the university can solve. Not your doing. But a fantastic talent and skill. Not saying it's not. But let's relate to it in a healthy way, as it really is. And as the false beliefs dissolve, what starts to be revealed is, so who am I if I'm not the doer? So then we come to a definition of what the human being is. So going back, so moving on to, well, actually, let me not move so far away from the proof that my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. We also, on the converse, know that from time to time we find ourselves in painful situations, and especially if the belief in doership and attachment to outcome has started to fade, started to get weaker, what we can start to see is that we find ourselves in painful situation, suffering might arise, and then a thought arises, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And that thought, which is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance we find ourselves in, pain being there plus suffering arising, and then a thought comes, actually, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and it cuts off the attachment to outcome, let's say, that's functioning, and we find ourselves at peace. And then we have our own first-hand experience that says, my happiness is not obscured by pain. Because I find myself in a painful situation. 1 minute I was suffering or unhappy, and then something came and cut off not the pain, the circumstance remains just as it was a moment before, but something comes and cuts off the suffering, and I find myself at peace in the face of painful situation. So we put a tick next to it. My happiness is not dependent on pleasure or pain. And to the extent that more and more ticks get put next to these concepts, and the misunderstanding, the false identity starts to fall away, we find for ourselves that our experience becomes more and more painful, more and more peaceful, even in the face of pain. And the process really starts to snowball once the evidence starts to come in. So once we've reached a critical tipping point, we start to see what is being pointed at that previously wasn't our experience. We start to get access to experience that really starts to show that these old beliefs were completely erroneous. Fictitious fantasy, really. At some point, we might look back and say, wow, how did I believe? I just simply can't see life like that anymore. And we could say that this is coming to see life as it is, where the beliefs that were like a lens through which we saw life, that colored life as, and they fall away, and then now I'm seeing life as it is. Can we pass the microphone over there? But before I answer that, I just want to go back to a description of what the human being is, according to these concepts, according to my own experience. And it's what gets revealed once the false beliefs start to fall away. And the description is that the human being is a combination of the impersonal consciousness of Source that has linked and identified with a particular body-mind organism, the vehicle, and is functioning through that vehicle as personal consciousness, which really means that what is looking through your eyes right now is the consciousness of Source. The notion that there is God out there, that there is God experiencing the life I experience through some sort of universal CCTV system, right, is a belief and a concept of God that doesn't exist. And our concept of God needs to be refined so that there's an awareness of what's happening right here, right now. And how often have we considered, we've heard it, and sometimes it's called blasphemy if it's misunderstood, when someone says, there's a realization, I am God. What it's really pointing at, I'm not God in a creative sense. I have no creative capacity at all, except for what flows through me as a result of my genes up-to-date conditioning. I can't manifest anything. That's another concept, another teaching, which has its place for sure. But if we look at that, we'll find that at some point we need to drop that, because the reason it's very exciting is because it tells us that one day you'll be able to get all the pleasure that you think you need. And not only are you the doer, but you're the creator of the whole universe. And to the extent that we run with that concept, we might have a certain view on life, but inevitably the attachment to outcome is actually possibly being reinforced. The attachment to pleasure being my completeness and my happiness could be being reinforced. And the doership aspect, in seeing myself as the doer and seeing the other as the doer, could also be significantly reinforced, which means I might believe myself to be the creator and manifester, but I'm definitely going to still blame the other and myself. So what's this I am God business? It's the realization that, oh, God is not out there experiencing the world. What the human being is the one impersonal consciousness of Source that has linked to, in this case, 40 individual body-mind organisms, and is functioning through each one as personal consciousness. So the consciousness that I know as my consciousness, yes, it is my consciousness, because life is seen from this perspective, and you see life from your perspective. But what is seeing life? What is recognizing life? It's the one impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through 7 billion different vehicles. And when we don't realize this, what happens is we see the other as an enemy, as a competitor, as a rival. We see the other as someone who in any moment can deliver pain to me, which is an attack on who I am. And then we're forced to live life in a way where we are suspicious of the other, we are fearful of the other. And that's the contracted sense of self, which is attitudinal. And to the extent that life is a story of suffering. It's a story of forgetting oneself, suffering as a result, and at some point, a story of the forgetting falling away, the beliefs falling away, and a remembering, and then the end of suffering. And so, Ramesh used to say, the fact we're not the doer and we're not in control, there's no need to be pessimistic, because we find ourselves in this situation, something that according to this concept is not our doing, and yet here we are, being exposed to a set of concepts, new conditioning, that are generally not what is permeated through our daily life. And so Ramesh would say we're actually God's favorites, that the story of life, destiny, is putting us in this situation where the new conditioning may well bring about significant change. So I'm not the doer, but no reason to be pessimistic.
First of all, I just want to thank you. I just very much resonate with what you're saying and very touched by it. But there's something that you described that I have a different kind of experience with, and I want to ask you what your take is on that. And it has to do with suffering and observing suffering and recognizing that it's not personal, and that's just the unfoldment of how things are, and detaching in a way from wanting it to be different or needing to make anything happen. Mm-hmm. But many times at that point, well, what you just said is that if you can recognize that it's not, we're not attached to being happy or not being happy, and we recognize it's not our doing, then there's a peace of mind. But I don't necessarily experience that. Mm-hmm. It's like I can recognize and detach, this is happening, and sort of release. But I see that I'm still experiencing suffering, though I'm not suffering with my suffering. Mm-hmm. But I also notice that I don't necessarily feel peace. It's hanging in there. It's a weight. Mm-hmm. And it's curious because then I hear somebody give a talk and say, well, if you see things in this way, then there's just this peace of mind. Oddly enough, at some point, maybe an hour or 2 or 3, I actually noticed that there is kind of peace of mind. But in the moment when I'm having that experience and perceiving it in a way that seems to me detaching and releasing. It's like and then I hear you say, well, then if you do that, there's peace of mind. But my experience is that there isn't peace of mind necessarily in that moment. And the other thing is that isn't thinking that there should be peace of mind an attachment and an expectation?
You're the best audience. Yeah, exactly. See, and I'm not telling anyone to do these things and that there will be peace of mind. Right? That's what we hear at first, because I've only been speaking for whatever, a limited amount of time, so we haven't been able to sort of talk about the pitfalls and talk about what is really being said. So everything that's said is a description of life, or a description of what might happen, and not a prescription of something to do. The doer in us says, oh great, I want peace of mind, that sounds great. I want that, how am I going to get it? And then it says, oh, Roger said to do this, so now I can get peace of mind by doing this. So this is completely normal for the doer belief inside of us. And to the extent that we see what's happening is that the doer has hijacked the concepts and is turning them into a prescription of something to achieve, something that me, the separate independent doer, is going to do. Then at some point the intellectual understanding that hopefully has gone deeper and deeper will catch it and go, I've now got an expectation of life being peace, 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 peace. And as soon as there is suffering, I'm going to resist the suffering as an invalid part of life, because there's an expectation that there is now peace, 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 peace. Before we were looking for pleasure, 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 pleasure.
Another P.
Yeah. And so these dynamics, if the basic principles are understood, will get caught as being suffering. They'll be seen as being suffering, and then we say, what is this suffering? And we'll see it's an expectation, and there's an idea that I am the doer. So how does investigation happen? Investigation is something that everything, just thinking, just happens based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. The concepts that are put forward here is new conditioning that then becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning. We don't need to do anything. We just need to live our life, which is a happening. You wake up in the morning and you feel this urge to go to the bathroom. Just biologically, you do that. It is a happening. So you just continue to live life as we always have, which from this perspective is a happening. We might still see it as our doing. What's being pointed at is we do that, we go in and we stub our toe on the door as we're walking into the bathroom. And it's pain, and the thought arises, this is pain in the moment. And to the extent we see that thought is a reaction to the circumstance, which is stub toe, pain in the moment, and our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Our up-to-date conditioning includes these concepts. And the thought arises, pain in the moment. Not your doing, a happening, and yet it happened. So that is the investigation, an investigation that no one does. An investigation that happens. And so to the extent that it's our destiny for this investigation to continue happening, and if that investigation happens, the concept gets that becomes new conditioning, so it further ingrains the intellectual understanding, which then means as we go through the rest of our day, it's quite possible that the investigation continues to happen. And so then that ties in with what you said, is that the more things are seen, the more the old beliefs no longer have a possibility of surviving. The old beliefs remained in place because this new way of seeing life, which is not my doing but a happening, hadn't happened. And so the old beliefs seem to be true. As soon as we start getting new evidence, then the old beliefs start getting questioned and eventually fall away. So what you described is what is in the teaching talk referred to as primary involvement and secondary involvement. And so to the extent that we understand the concepts intellectually doesn't mean that the suffering is going to get cut off. What we find is we understand the concepts intellectually, we go out into life, pain is delivered, and what we thought was a solid understanding where we think, oh, I think I've got it. I think that I will now live life peacefully because I understand that pain is not an attack on who I am. My true nature is unaffected by pleasure or pain. I remain complete whether there is pain or pleasure. And so we think, I've got it. Then we go out into life. Someone has parked their car right in front of yours or behind yours and you can't get out. The understanding goes out the window and there's a whole lot of blame. So we can see that the intellectual understanding needs to go deeper and deeper and deeper so that it uproots the beliefs. And to the extent that the beliefs haven't been completely uprooted, the suffering is still going to be there. But now we will understand what suffering is because of the intellectual understanding. Our suffering is a result of this belief in personal doership that hasn't yet been uprooted. So to the extent that we see that the other isn't a doer, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, and yet suffering is still arising, we can witness the suffering as a happening based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which still includes the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. It doesn't exist on the conscious level because you're aware that your happiness isn't to be found in pleasure and pain. But we say, but it must exist on a deeply ingrained level because the suffering is still arising. So to the extent that the suffering becomes understood, and we still know that suffering is going to be uncomfortable, so it is then also allowed to arise as a happening, not your doing. Suffering is also based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning. The up-to-date conditioning, in this case, is I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure. And so if suffering is, I'm destined for there to be suffering in this moment, destined for there to be the pain that triggered the suffering, and destined for there to be suffering. So to the extent that this seeing life as a happening goes deeper in it, what happens is there is a witnessing of even suffering as a happening. And if we witness suffering as a happening, it means that the suffering itself we can call the primary suffering. So if someone has said they were going to pick you up at 12 o'clock, it's now 1:30 and you're standing on the side of the road, hot, bothered, late for your appointment because they haven't picked you up and they're an hour and a half late. So there is blame towards the other. And we understand, we see that there is blame, and we understand it comes from my current genes and up-to-date conditioning that still includes the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. To the extent it's allowed to be there as a happening in the moment, we won't feel guilty for blaming the other. And if we don't see it as a happening, then the belief in personal doership that might say, I shouldn't blame the other, I'm a failure for blaming the other, and then we have the painful situation, the blame towards the other, and maybe secondary suffering of guilt towards oneself, or secondary suffering of pushing away the blame, whichever it happens to be, resistance to the blame. So the understanding of non-doership starts on the outer levels and works its way in. So to the extent that we see the primary suffering is still there, but the secondary suffering isn't there, we see, the secondary suffering isn't there because the primary suffering is being witnessed as a happening, which is the attitude of non-doership in play.
Right.
So this isn't so this is not a magic solution. Life will always unfold as it's destined to unfold. Not your doing, not my doing. But the story of life which unfolds not randomly but according to it appears on the surface, it's a story of cause and effect on the surface. Like deeper down, when we see the fundamental nature of life, we realize, cause and effect is just apparent. Everything is spontaneous or a creation. But on the surface, it's a story of time and space, cause and effect. And to the extent that in the story there is understanding of these concepts, let's say, a seeing life, then it means that the effect has to be in line with the cause. So if life brings about a certain realization, then life down the track is probably going to unfold in such a way that suffering is less because there is a realization. And if life puts in place strong beliefs of doership, then the consequence is going to be suffering, cause and effect. But it wouldn't make sense for life to dissolve the beliefs completely and then for suffering to arise, because that would be a nonsensical creation. It wouldn't follow the rules of cause and effect. If the beliefs have completely been dissolved, then life will take the suffering away. But we're not in control of how completely the beliefs get dissolved and when. But to the extent that your awareness is landing on these aspects, means we can look at it and feel confident that things are moving in the right direction.
Hi, two questions. One is, to the extent that thoughts arise which seem to be doer thoughts, so the prior conditioning was to always try to better your circumstance. So to try to better, so I'm talking about my personal experience, to better myself or to better my circumstances. And to the extent that now I'm noticing when thoughts arise, if I'm in a particular situation, for example, if I'm sick, and thoughts may arise saying, maybe you need to go and take better care of yourself, or drink some green juice, or whatever it may be. Does that mean that those thoughts are related still to the belief that I'm the doer?
No, not necessarily. So this doesn't make us unintelligent, the falling away of doership and attachment to outcome. It doesn't mean that we still don't have a biological intelligence. So the attitude of doership doesn't dissolve our biological preferences and our biological makeup. So once the attitude of doership falls away, someone might say, well, what's going to motivate me to move in life? Because we might think, well, I'm not attached to outcomes, and therefore I'm just going to sit here. And so this allows us to elaborate on what attachment to outcomes mean. Attachment to outcomes mean the belief that my completeness and my happiness is dependent on outcomes. So that is what attachment to outcomes is referring to. It's not talking about the fact that I see pleasure as inconsequential. So pleasure is still going to be pleasure. Pain is still going to be pain. So when the belief that my completeness is to be found in pleasure falls away, the body is still going to move towards pleasure and away from pain. And it's still going to have an intelligence that says, I'm feeling sick, I should go to the doctor, or could go to the doctor, or have some juice. That will arise as it arises. The difference is that if the pleasure that the body is moving towards is not delivered, there will be an acceptance, which simply means the absence of non-acceptance.
And would that mean an acceptance also that maybe you're going to die? You accept. So, for example, if you're really sick, so supposing I'm really sick and I can't get help. I've tried and I can't get help. And it leads to the thoughts that, well, maybe this is it. And in that moment, there's this sort of acceptance that, this is it. And there's no suffering as a result of it. That's just it. And does that mean that you're still the doer? That you didn't help yourself or you gave up?
Well, once again, it depends where that where that conclusion comes from. If it comes from a belief, because remember, we can have the belief that I am the doer, and then we can have the belief I am not the doer. And the belief I am not the doer is not freedom. The belief I am not the doer is a new belief system.
Yes, I think I've fallen into that trap.
Yeah, which is not a bad trap to fall into as long as you get out of it, because the belief I am not the doer dissolves the belief I am the doer, and then you have a belief that's a much newer belief, which is, when it's seen, it's like, oh, I've fallen into a belief that I am not the doer. And actually, freedom is the freedom from a belief of who I am. Which includes both the doer and I'm not the doer. But the concept I'm the doer, if it's used as a concept, dissolves the belief I am the doer, and it may or may not become a new belief system. If it becomes a new belief system, which many spiritual teachings tend to put in place, it's just how the teaching process works. It uses one concept to uproot an old belief, but inevitably those concepts get turned into, because we're prone as human for a period of time to turn concepts into beliefs, they get turned into, and so Ramana Maharshi's teaching has a very beautiful saying, which is, use this thorn to remove the thorn which is embedded in your thumb, but then be sure to throw both thorns away. And so the thorn embedded in the thumb is a concept that has been turned into a belief. Like, I am the doer is a concept which society tells us and which our experience tells us. The experience on the surface is designed to feel like I am the doer. If we go to our experience, that's what it tells us. And so then that concept arises, I am the doer, and it gets turned into a belief, which means a concept related to as truth. And no concept is truth. So whenever we relate to a concept as truth, which is a belief, problem, false idea of who we are. And so Ramana's saying that be sure to throw both thorns away is not because he thinks that we will throw both thorns away, but because he knows that a spiritual teaching will uproot a belief, and inevitably that thorn will get embedded as the new belief system. And so it's there just to so we go, oh, actually I didn't throw both thorns away. I now see that it's embedded as a new belief. And then the seeing of it is effectively a third thorn being used to uproot the thorn that's now embedded in the thumb. And then maybe we're lucky to throw all thorns away.
I get it. And when the belief I'm not the doer is now in place, it refutes action. So it refutes thoughts that come up, because all the thoughts are being watched. And it refutes the thoughts which come up, which say do this or do that, or act in this way, or better your life, or whatever it may be, and immediately the counter thought is, well, I'm not the doer, so whatever needs to happen will happen on its own, so let me just watch.
Mm-hmm. Which is not your doing. Right? So that thought, the turning the belief, the second concept into a belief is not your doing, it's what happened. Right? And to the extent that the thoughts come up and cut off intelligent instruction, to the extent that happens, that's destiny unfolding exactly as it's not your doing. So no reason to feel guilt or frustration. But if you do feel guilt or frustration, destiny. And at any moment there is the potential for us to see it for what it is. And that seeing it for what it is becomes the beginning of its dissolution. Which is, once again, that's why we're here, the light of awareness burns up ignorance. We don't really, it's just as soon as ignorance, which is a mistake, comes into awareness, that is its undoing, because ignorance is a lie in a sense. Not a lie that an individual is creating. And so this is why the process doesn't require a doer. A doer to do it.
Okay, and really quickly, a different thought. So since the last satsang, a thought's been arising constantly as I look at people, that they're the self. And I keep looking at people, and it's like when you see through your eyes and you know that it's not the you that's seeing through the eyes kind of experience. And I keep looking at people, and the thought keeps arising. They're the self, and the more ignorant the people are, the thought arises. That's the self who's forgotten who they are. And when that happens, the counter that's happening is that it's like, you got to be kidding me, right? I mean, here I am taking another belief on. So how do I stop that? Or just let it, I guess, that there's the doer again.
Ramesh used to like it when someone inevitably, after the first 45 minutes of talking about how there's no doer and that life is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, that our suffering in each moment is part of destiny, just like the pleasure and pain is part of destiny, and that the very idea that I am the doer and can control my life is suffering. So after 45 minutes of that, someone says, this is great. So how do I bring about the end of suffering? And so, you have a little chuckle, because, you want to know how you can do, which is not, it's not a criticism in fun. It's just showing how the destined story of life and the doer principle just wants to do. And so what you were touching on before is very important. This is not a crusade against pleasure. What it's pointing out is that pleasure will always be part of life. On a biological level, the body, even after liberation, if you want to call it that, is still going to move towards pleasure and enjoy pleasure. So it's not about saying that we should stop enjoying pleasure. It's just pointing to our attitude to pleasure, which is an attitude that is out of line with what pleasure actually is. Pleasure is pleasure, but it isn't a defining factor of who I am. And to the extent that we start seeing our attachment to pleasure, where we see it, I am relating to the flow of life as if it is a defining factor of who I am. And to the extent that we start dropping that, and the way we drop it, because it sounds like we drop it, right? But all the time it's just a description of what might happen. To the extent a thought arises and says, actually my happiness is never to be found in the flow of life. To the extent that thought comes up and it cuts off the attachment, then what we find is a resting in being happening more and more, and we come to know for ourselves that what I am, this essence that is ever present, we come to know for ourselves that it remains unaffected by the flow of life. And that becomes first-hand evidence as we rest in being more and more. And we rest in being when the attachment, the thoughts that say, I need this to be a certain way, why isn't it this way? All of that cuts off our being. The thought arises, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. And we drop into being. And we know ourselves for what we are, what we always have been. And the more we rest there, the more first-hand evidence we have of what I am at my core. And then even death is the ultimate assault, let's say on the biological. Death is the ultimate pain. Not physical pain, but the ultimate assault on the biological. Mm-hmm. To the extent we are grounded in this being that knows itself to always be. Mm-hmm. It knows itself, not an intellectual level, but because it is that place in the heart, which is a place outside of the realm of thinking, mm-hmm. is the junction point, mm-hmm. whereby impersonal consciousness links to the body, mm-hmm. and turns into personal consciousness. Mm-hmm. To the point we rest in this in the heart, where mm-hmm. we know I am, we're informed about a lot of things that the intellect won't ever know. Mm-hmm. And the information is not something that I even know. Like, I don't know how I know some things. Mm-hmm. And when I say I know them, I don't know them in a way where I'm aware that I know them. Mm-hmm. But I know that I've been faced with death, actually. Mm-hmm. And at the time when I was ill in a way where it was quite possible that I was going to get news that you're dying, mm-hmm. there was a peace. And I know that that peace comes from a knowing that I don't know up here. Mm-hmm. A knowing that is an information, meaning I'm informed of my true nature. Mm-hmm. A nature that is essentially connected to Source. Mm-hmm. And Source is not something that dies with the death of the body. Mm-hmm. And so from that place of resting in being, even death is not an assault on mm-hmm. who I am. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I have the other belief of what I am, which is a separate independent entity, primarily the physical body, no connection, no experience of this formless, unchanging self, mm-hmm. then of course the flow of life in the smallest way is an attack on my idea of myself, and death is the ultimate attack on that idea of myself.
Okay, and then a thought just came to me that my desire to ask you questions and get clarity, is that the doer too?
No, not necessarily. Well, actually, so let's be clear. There never has been a doer in all of time. There has never been a doer. What there has been is a belief in doership, a belief that sees everything that is happening in life as my doing and your doing, and I could have done better, you could have done better, I should have done this, I could have done that. It's an attitude. So the doer is an attitude. There never is, there never has been, there never will be a single doer in the whole of time. Never has been a single doer. The realization of this, I simply cannot be the doer, is the dissolving of this belief in doership, and it reveals my connection to Source. And whatever happens through me is essentially Source functioning through me. Whatever happens through the other is Source functioning through the other. And even the atrocious acts in life is Source functioning through the other, because this is a story of duality. This creation is not a. It's not a. It's not a comedy. It's a combination of a drama and a romance story, a horror movie, a comedy. It's all of it. Yes. So this is a creation of duality, and duality means good and bad, big and small, health and disease, wealth and poverty, male and female, hot and cold. So the atrocious acts are not okay, but everything is source except for that. That's the doer over there. We have to once we come to a different idea of what the creation is and what God is, once our idea of God starts to be refined, you could say, we see, source at rest, pure potentiality, right, in its unmanifest form, infinite creative potentiality, which is absolute nothing. It's in its resting form, it is the unmanifest. At some point, has to explode into manifestation, has to explode into creation. It's its nature because it's pure potentiality. Not nothing, dead nothing, but potential nothing. It explodes into manifestation, and in this manifestation, we say it's a manifestation of time and space, starting with, theoretically, we say the Big Bang, and ending wherever it ends. The whole story of time is a creation that comes out of infinite creative potentiality, and so God is not outside looking at its creation, laughing at the different characters or crying at the atrocity. It hasn't said to everyone, okay, go for it. Do your best. Right? How can characters in a creation do anything? So if we come to see that infinite creative potentiality, source address, has become the manifestation. So it has become the duality, it has become the good and the bad, the acts of kindness and the acts of evil. And so God has become the victim and the perpetrator for the experience of it. And when the experience falls away, much like a dream that is brought into existence in the mind of the dreamer, let's say, the dream can be atrocious, and yet when it falls away, to whom did the atrocities happen? While in the dream, it's very personal, and it can seem like a cruel dream. It is a cruel dream from within the dream. But there isn't a God being cruel to an individual. God has become the individual and the cruelty and the kindness. And when it's all said and done, nothing ever happened. So we start with absolute nothing that becomes everything to return to nothing. So Ramana said, there is no creation, there is no dissolution, nothing ever happened. Which, when we come to see the nature of self as formless, the pleasure and pain in life is understood and accepted. Accepted is not something we do, it's just the absence of non-acceptance. So when non-acceptance isn't there, there is what we call acceptance, which is not something that we do, it's just the absence of non-acceptance. When we know ourself, then there is the understandability of the pleasure and the pain in life, and a natural acceptance because it's known that this is not as significant as it used to be seen. Which doesn't make us insensitive, it still means that if we find ourselves in a situation, we know that we have empathy for someone who is identified with the body and therefore attached to pleasure and pain, understanding that the uncomfortableness is the most uncomfortable thing. And so one way or another, that compassion or empathy can show itself, either by not supporting their story or by showing affection in an overt way. Either way, that's compassion. It doesn't have to take a particular form. It's compassion because we know that it's not, the suffering is not real, but we understand that while it exists in the dream, it's as if it's real. Pass it.
Thank you.
I'm not sure of the time. Okay, 9 o'clock. We'll make this the last question, unless someone has a really strong burning one after that.
So, so it sounds like, I mean, what are your thoughts on prayer? Because it sounds like we're not the doers. So this realization for every person is going to come if it's God's will.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
If someone prays, it's God's will for that praying to happen. I mean, part of the creation, which is all God's will according to these concepts. And in my experience, as the understanding deepens, prayer turns from effectively begging for things to being grateful for life as it is, which isn't. This isn't a judgment or a criticism. It's an observation of how our understanding forces us to pray, or our misunderstanding forces us to pray. When there is a disconnection from self, as in the belief of personal doership creates this contracted sense that I am separate and alone and vulnerable. The suffering, which is so uncomfortable, forces seeking to happen in a desperate way sometimes, and it also forces praying in a desperate way. So we can see that the prayer of a certain type is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning and the experience in the moment. And it is destiny unfolding when that suffering becomes weaker and weaker, and then life is seen differently and the prayer changes. So at some point I found that the prayer I would offer up was this, more or less. It was, if I was feeling something was still there, and say, God, take this with a grain of salt, because I don't even know what I really need. Right? But I'm quite certain from what has been seen that it is the belief in personal doership that keeps me from being a servant to God, keeps me from knowing my connection to Source. And I would like you to know, to whatever extent there is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome in me, feel free to take it. And I knew that prayer was, in a sense, an exclamation of insight that had been delivered. My old prayer would have been something very different. Please, God, give me a bicycle when I was 8 years old, maybe. Why? Because I thought that a bicycle was my happiness.
Because I can intellectualize what you say about, I'm not the doer, I shouldn't place my happiness on outcomes. But because I still feel a very strong attachment to who I think I am, this personality, some of my desires are stronger than others. And so it's harder to let go of that. But if you say, like, it doesn't really matter what you do, it's not up to me or up to anyone. It sounds like it's going to happen when it's God's will to happen, that I come to that realization. Right? So.
That is what's being said. And to the doer, that sounds like bad news, right? To the extent that we get that it's actually all happening, that getting it is the progression. It is the suffering identity dissolving. Wow, it's so what seems like really sad news, that I'm not in control, I'm not the doer. An acceptance of it, which is either going to happen or not, according to the acceptance of it, which sounds like, wow, I can't accept that, that's terrible news, is actually the deepening of the understanding. And so this, remember in some of the wording that was used, it's, I shouldn't be attached to outcomes, for example. That's not what the concepts are saying. The concepts are saying, if we are attached to outcomes, there will be suffering. If it's destined for the attachment to fall away, then attachment to outcomes will fall away. If I was saying, you shouldn't, I'm treating you as a doer that could, or can choose. So the concepts are descriptions, and then the descriptions become part of our up-to-date conditioning. We might see that, I'm attached to outcomes, and there is suffering. And then a part of us, functioning, the intellectual understanding, might cut off that attachment, just by the thought arising, actually, what I am is, to the extent that we've found a potential to drop into being. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But to whatever extent the process has unfolded, a thought might arise and say, and cut off the suffering. And then we realize that that's not me saying I shouldn't be attached to outcome. It's just the understanding coming up and saying, attachment to outcome is not where my happiness is to be found. Right? So the doership gets weaker and weaker and weaker. But to start with, it's going to hear the concepts as something to do, and inevitably it's going to arise as another form of suffering, and that's okay, because as long as it gets seen, that's the progression.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Shoulds and shouldn'ts is a big one over the weekend for whoever chooses that this resonates with them, and that maybe it's actually a relevant way to spend the weekend, because it's all about what the concept suggests we're really looking for. Shoulds and shouldn'ts become something that is pointed out that in practical terms, the understanding needs to start being applied. And once we start seeing that we have this long list of shoulds and shouldn'ts that society has put in place or life has put in place, and we realize that the shoulds and shouldn'ts are effectively strategy to get pleasure, 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 pleasure. I shouldn't cancel the appointment I have because my friend will hate me. And to the extent that we realize, that should and shouldn't is keeping me from doing something that I feel to do, we might realize that these shoulds and shouldn'ts are keeping me disconnected from a flow in life. And one of the ways that the beliefs start to really dissolve in practical terms is where we start realizing, I'm not going to live according to a whole list of shoulds and shouldn'ts. Because my list of shoulds and shouldn'ts are supporting this identity of myself. And deep down, I think a lot of us know, if we're living from shoulds and shouldn'ts, there's something inside that tells us that this isn't freedom. And it builds up, and the uncomfortableness tends to become greater and greater and greater until such time we just change how we're living. And so I'll explain that for me, when it became clear that what I was really looking for is the end of internal conflict, and it started to become apparent that this internal conflict was a fight between what my body was telling me to do in each moment, an instruction that I came to find out was a very intelligent instruction, versus what my head was telling me I should and shouldn't do. And that was my internal conflict. This fight between what the body was telling me to do, what the intelligence of the biology was telling me, versus the unintelligence of an attachment to outcomes. So, thank you, everyone.